Continuing on from the first part. Google. Nice little condescending jab with the Google remark, but if that's what you're using for your research, well, I'll do you one better. Scholar.google.com. Go ahead, try it. Next. So what? You mentioned in closing that Aisha went on to become a great woman and a military leader in Islam. Well, what does that have to do with your case? I would expect that this would happen, especially as you say that the marriage was more an arrangement between your alleged prophet and Aisha's father, and she was being groomed as, for lack of a better word, a successor, or at least an acolyte of the alleged prophet. As such, there would have been immediate and concentrated attention on her development from many sources. It makes sense that her life would have taken this path just by virtue of being the alleged prophet's last wife. This would have happened regardless of her readiness at 6 years of age for marrying a 51-year-old or at 9 years of age for having sex with a 54-year-old man. Next. Psychosocial maturity. Just because a girl has gone through puberty doesn't mean she is ready for sex or marriage. You recognize this. There were a couple of things in your question and dodge the answer session with Happy Cabby that you said you were going to learn about and clarify for us later. In that Q&DTA session, you stated that Aisha was psychosocially tested to determine her maturity. When asked what capability they would have had at that time of assessing psychosocial maturity and what these tests were, you mentioned showing skill in financial transactions, how they interact at home, and how they take care of themselves, as 3 examples. You seem to have a certain level of knowledge of the tests that were performed and what the requirements would have been to successfully demonstrate psychosocial maturity, but you didn't get into that detail. I was disappointed to see that you didn't include any of that information in your video, because you see, that kind of information would go a long way toward building some credible evidence for your case. Specifically, a record of how Aisha performed in those tests, showing she was indeed a highly exceptional child and would have been excellent support of your point. So where is it, Ali? Did you forget? Maybe you don't know what the tests were, or maybe the tests were entirely inappropriate for properly determining psychosocial maturity. Now, I remember at age probably 7, maybe 8, going alone to the corner store before school with my allowance, knowing how much I had, working out in my head as I walked there the options of what I could buy with it, and how much change I could expect to get back. I also remember having a lot of friends my age, but feeling more comfortable in engaging adults as peers in conversations. Many adults commented that I was very mature for my age, and my parents can attest to this. Lastly, I was always sure to brush my teeth regularly and had regular baths, tended to wear clean clothes, and combed my hair, sometimes without being reminded. I doubt I'd be considered ready for marriage or sex, though, just because of that. Now yes, that is applying today's principles to ancient practices, but again, the claim of your alleged prophet providing us with a perfect example that we should be emulating today is defeated by the fact that this is not 1400 years ago, at least not in the Western world. His example, if he was indeed divine, if he was indeed the most perfect messenger of God, should still be a shining moral beacon even by today's standards. But when one pauses to think and considers that there are millions, probably billions of examples of people on this earth today who are not 54 years old and having sex with 9-year-old girls, or sentencing women to death by stoning, or torturing people, or burning people, or beheading people, the list goes on, then the claim of your alleged prophet being the most perfect man who ever existed or ever will exist disappears into the fog of wishful thinking, and continuing to insist so encroaches upon the sin of idolatry. In fact, not only is his example inappropriate, it's downright illegal in most of the civilized world, whether you or I think is legally pedophilia or not. I'm not making a value judgment on Muslims as pedophiles or that it's anything Islam promotes. That is not my claim, so stop misrepresenting me there too, Ali. My only claim, and I have said this from the start, is that your alleged prophet's example is far from perfect, and it takes remarkably little effort to make that case. But that claim of perfection of your alleged prophet is yours. That is your claim, and needs to be backed up by evidence. I do know that Islam wears a duplicitous face on a great many things, but at least it requires the acknowledgement of the heinous nature of such things to recognize that it requires that duplicitous face. This recognition of the imperfection by the Islamic nations is witnessed by the evidence that you yourself provided in your response to me. In order to demonstrate how progressive the Muslim world is while taking yet another ad hom shot at me, you provide as proof information on how high the age of consent has been raised in Muslim countries. So those progressive countries recognize the inappropriateness of the action you are trying to minimize, and part of that action, the taking of a child bride, that on April 23, 2007 was declared by the United Nations to be a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, the United Nations Convention on Consent to Marriage, minimum age for marriage and registration of marriages in 1964, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination of Women in 1979, and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child in 1990. Your argument of different times, different cultures, different rules does not apply, because at some point along the way, as we developed and we advanced societally, we learned better and decided pretty much as a planet that taking a child for a bride is pretty fucked up. This is the example we are to emulate. You cited, I think it was Egypt, as your only named example, having raised the age of consent to 16, so I'll play along and counter that with only one example. A 2009 study posted in the International Journal of Humanities and Social Sciences, links, showed that in a survey of rural Bangladeshi marriages, almost 60% of married Muslim women were in their first marriage before the age of 16. This study actually uses real data, collected specifically for the study, and from which the researcher is able to draw a conclusion. The study compares the rural Muslim population with the rural Santal population, and the Muslims actually fare just a little better than the Santals, with the Santals having almost 63% of their girls being married before the age of 16. But I'm certain that you'll agree with me that 60% or 63% doesn't matter, as this is unacceptable practice. You said so yourself, and this only illustrates that this little argument doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme. As you challenged with the Muslim scholar's point, we can toss countering examples at each other all day until your alleged prophet orders up a pulled pork and bacon sandwich. A side note is that the Santals are equal opportunists and marry their boys off early as well, leaving the Muslims with a wider age gap between husbands and wives. But that's neither here nor there, really, and I only mention that for the indulgence of a cheap giggle. You have to abandon reason in order to make the claims you do. When you present something like this as truth, then claim that it is authoritative and not to be disputed or doubted, then it becomes dogma. And dogmatism is something I will never cease to oppose, no matter which religion you practice. One final thing, not related to the topic at hand, but something I feel is key to helping us understand a little of where you're coming from here. While I have your ear, I hope you'll indulge me. I'll provide a little explanation for the audience. According to Islam, the world is divided into three houses: Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, and Dar al-Kufr. These divisions are not found in the Quran or the Hadith, but they were created in the 13th and 14th century as the Muslim leaders needed to create geopolitical divisions to help identify the world they were trying to conquer. Dar al-Islam is the House of Islam, and is also known as Dar as-Salam or Dar al-Tawhid. These are countries where Muslims are not persecuted. Typically, they are cultures where Muslims are the majority, and they have full political control. Basically, they're Islamic countries. Dar al-Harb is the House of War, and is also known as Dar al-Garb, which translates as House of the West. These are not Islamic countries, at least not yet. Basically, these are countries who have been exposed to Islam, but where the Muslim law is not in force. The third house, Dar al-Kufr, is the House of Disbelief. Basically, these are lands that have not yet been exposed to Islam. Essentially, the objective is to turn all Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Kufr territories into Dar al-Islam territories. If asked to identify the Western world as one of these houses, I suspect Ali would answer none of the above, and give the answer of Dar al-Dawah, or House of Invitation. This is a more modern geopolitical division than the main three, and is really a light or politically correct version of Dar al-Harb, the House of War. There's that duplicitous face of Islam that I mentioned earlier. So now the question I will leave you with, Ali. How do you categorize the Western world? I'm Smiling Skeptic. Be excellent to each other, and peace.